This video gives a brief overview of the policies and regulations that control the communication industry. We will discuss two philosophical approaches to communication policy, then go over the three main types of regulations imposed on the communication industry. People who shape communication policy generally take one of two philosophical approaches to regulation. Some see communication policy as a means of liberating users of communication technologies, while others see it as a means of controlling users. Some examples of liberating communication policies include net neutrality protections, antitrust laws, and speech protections. Examples of controlling communication policies include limitations on the use of broadcast frequencies and FCC regulations regarding what can or cannot be shown on television. Regulations imposed on the communication industry can be sorted into three main categories: content regulations, structural regulations, and technical regulations. Let's explore those now. Content regulations are rules regarding what can or cannot be shown, broadcast, or shared in print, on television, and on the internet. This type of regulation is restricted to varying degrees by the First Amendment, which prevents government restriction on speech. Print media enjoy the strongest First Amendment protections and therefore the least amount of content restriction, as courts tend to prioritize allowing speech and punishing it later if necessary, i.e. if it is defamatory or otherwise breaks the law, rather than permitting policies that would constitute prior restraint on the free press. Broadcast television receives the weakest First Amendment protection, meaning that it is the most strongly regulated. Courts have generally cited the wide reach of free broadcast television and protection of children as the reason for these increased regulations. The internet is very difficult to regulate, and the ongoing evolution of this kind of communication policy will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on as the internet becomes increasingly integrated into our everyday lives. Structural regulations are limitations on who can enter communication markets and how they can obtain the proper permissions to do so. These regulations help to ensure that consumers will have fair access to information and options for how to gain that access. They are also intended to prevent monopolies and promote market health. An example of this kind of regulation is the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was intended to promote competition and help lower prices. Finally, technical regulations control aspects of the communication industry that are affected by technological factors. The best example of this type of regulation is the practice of issuing licenses for broadcasting over certain mediums and/or frequencies, a practice which has its roots in the early days of radio. Licensing is intended to reduce broadcasting redundancies that result in interference. Another example of a technical regulation is the 2009 government-mandated switch from analog to digital television broadcasting. In this video, we have discussed the liberating and controlling philosophical approaches to communication regulation. Additionally, we have discussed three kinds of regulations imposed on the communication industry: content, structural, and technical. These policies and regulations will continue to affect the communication industry going forward in time.